Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna say okay.
Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of March 16th. And one of the things I always look forward to, usually it's on a Sunday, sometimes it's on a Monday, is I get an email from this guy. His name is Steve Hashimoto. And you can probably see him on the screen if you're viewing the show, or you'll hear his voice shortly. But he does a weekly e-news called News from the Trenches. And basically, he includes not only what gigs he has as a musician, and he's a serious play all the time jazz musician out there in Chicagoland, but also information on what's going on among other musicians when people have passed. And he has a little bit of a marketplace at the end with cool books that he's done or that he has and various other things. So without further ado, as they used to say, how are you, Steve?
Pretty good, Mike.
Tell us a little bit about your where you grew up and how you got involved in music, because I want to focus on your music today and where people can hear you play and et cetera.
Well, I grew up in Chicago. I've lived in Chicago my whole life. Grew up basically in Edgewater and kind of Rogers Parkish. And I met you through Rising Up Angry.
Right.
Because I was in a rock band in the late 60s, early 70s. We eventually were called Wacker Drive.
I remember.
There were several Wacker Drives in Chicago, just as there are several Wacker Drive streets. But we played a couple of Rising Up Angry dances, and we were interviewed for the newspaper, and the guys in my band I was the only guy in the band that was not from their neighborhood. They all went to Amundsen and Lane High School, and I went to Senn. So we should have the interview in your basement because I had Chicago Seed and Rising Up Angry covers on my wall, and I had hippie posters, and they just figured that I would be able to answer any political questions that your interviewer asked me. And I don't know who it was who interviewed us, and I don't have much recollection of it, but I do know that was the beginning of our connection with each other. So that probably would have been in 1970.
We'll look through and see if I can find that interview.
I'd love to see that.
After you played in this rock band, Wacker Drive, tell us a little bit about your music career in Chicago, because I basically think you are what we would call a gigging musician, a jobber. You are playing gigs, working with different bands as well as your own band. Talk about how you moved from Wacker Drive and rock and roll to becoming a full-time, lifelong musician and what that entails.
So in Wacker Drive, I played trumpet, and that was kind of when I joined the band, we were a soul band. So we were a white soul band, a white greaser soul band.
With one Asian American.
Well, my cousin also was in the band.
Oh, two of you guys.
We also had a Cuban singer. So for a greaser band on the north side, we were pretty diverse, you know. But that was kind of the beginning of the Chicago Blood, Sweat, and Tears horn band era. So that's why I was in the band. But then when the scene started to turn towards hard rock, the band changed, the music changed, and I this is kind of a technical term, but I blew my chops out from playing loud rock and roll music on the trumpet, and I couldn't play anymore. So the band dissolved, and I became a guitar player, and I played guitar gigging for a while. There still wasn't quite a full-time professional musician, although I started my original, well, it wasn't original even at the time, my jazz fusion band called Mothra's Revenge, like the Japanese monster movie, Mothra.
I got it.
And so I played guitar in that band. And then an older bebop musician in Evanston named Jack Hubble called me one day and said, one of the guys in your band suggested I called you because I need a bass player this Saturday. And although he didn't say this, I just assume every bass player in Chicago was working that Saturday. And he said, I've got a Fender bass that you can borrow for the gig. And this is bebop language. He said, do you have eyes to make the gig? And I said, well, yeah. And so he asked me to come over to his house and play through a couple songs with him and see if it was going to be a disaster or not. And I guess I passed the audition. I became a bass player. And from that day on, I pretty much never stopped gigging because everybody needs bass players. So that was 1978, I think. And so I always tell people the difference between me and most other bass players my age is that my first gigs as a bass player were not rock and roll gigs. I was playing bebop and I was playing jazz standards from the moment I started playing bass. And so I was working immediately with older guys who were much better players than I was. And I was getting my butt kicked every night on the bandstand. I was getting yelled at all the time. But, eventually I learned how to play that music. And it wasn't until very long after I became a professional musician that I even played rock and roll on the bass. So I find that I'm kind of still learning how to play pop music and rock and roll on the bass. I've been playing jazz on the bass since 1979. And when you say a jobbing musician, what that means to us on the scene is we play any kind of gig that anybody calls us to play. Now, I make a caveat about that. I will only take gigs that I feel that I'm really qualified to play. So, I don't know much about certain styles of music. And so I'm not going to take those kinds of gigs because I don't want to stink up the band. But I play weddings, I play corporate music, I still play a lot of jazz, I play in several original rock and roll bands, Americana type bands, singer songwriter. I've played blues gigs, I've played country music, but that's what a jobbing musician does. And before the pandemic, what that meant was picking up the telephone, and sometimes I'd get a call at 8:30 in the evening, and somebody would say, "What are you doing tonight?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm watching TV. Can you get to the Get Me High Lounge in a half an hour?" And I'd go, And so that's what jobbing musicians used to be like. Now, the pandemic killed everything. I used to, at the height of the business, I was playing 500 gigs a year, which is a lot.
Wow.
Now, and the reason I could do that was because I used to play the late night after hours gig at the Green Mill that started at 2 a.m. So during the summertime, on a Friday, I could play 4 gigs. I could play a lunchtime concert downtown, outdoors. I could play an after work happy hour gig at some hotel downtown, then go play a rock and roll gig from 9 o'clock until 1 a.m. and still make it to the Green Mill and have 4 gigs in a day. Nowadays, I'm lucky if I play 3 or 4 gigs a week, and I say I'm lucky. Uh, like last week, or 2 weeks ago, I didn't have a single gig.
Well,
So
I see on your news from the trenches, sometimes you will be looking for someone to play with you. Sometimes you are looking for a gig to play. But I also see pretty regularly that you are playing at Simon's on Clark, and I think there's one other place that you play regularly.
yeah, the
Tell us about
Ravenswood
those
Tavern.
gigs.
So my band has been playing at Simon's at 5210 North Clark. We've been playing that gig for 25 years now. This new gig, we played the first Monday of the month at the Ravenswood Tavern on Montrose Avenue in Damon. We've been doing that for 5 years. That's another thing about aspect of my career is I have kind of been the king of the long standing gig. I played at the Green Mill for 30 years every Friday night. Um, I played at a place called Bacino's Pizza on Wacker Drive for 17 years. I've had many gigs that I've hung on to for a long time. And I like to think that it's mostly because the musicians that I use and the music that we play at these gigs uh, keeps people coming back, you know.
I'd like to hear a little bit about what it's been like since the pandemic, which really took the breath out of the the long haul of gigging musicians for a time. But you seem to have these two regular gigs at the Ravenswood Tap and at Simon's as ongoing things. What's your general take on the scene for not only your band, but the musicians as a whole, and particularly focus on jazz here in Chicago?
You know, I'm kind of a little bit removed from the jazz scene in general, so I can't speak with much authority. There seem to still be plenty of places for people to find gigs at, but I don't think that very many of the gigs pay a lot of money. Uh, and mostly, I think that, and it's always been this way, it's a lot of the younger guys, younger musicians coming out of college who have got the energy to go out and find a new place and turn it into a venue. It's not like, say, and you'll remember this, the old town days or the old Lincoln Avenue days, where there were 20 bars on Lincoln Avenue and in Old Town where you could play gigs and make a little more than we make nowadays. You could make a living playing jazz gigs, and many people did. I did for a long time, playing 5 or 6 jazz gigs a week until I found out how much money you make playing weddings. You play a wedding, you make the same money on one wedding as you made the whole week playing jazz gigs. But since the pandemic, uh, there are not that many wedding gigs, and there are probably more bar gigs than there are what we called jobbing dates. But the downside is that the bar gigs pretty much pay the same or less than they did 40 years ago. And
Yeah.
that's the truth. Uh, 40 years ago, you might make $40 or $50 at a bar, and that was considered pretty good money back then. That's still what you get paid at certain bar gigs nowadays. And of course, compared to the dollar back then, $40 it's a tank of gas.
Yeah. Well, Steve, let me ask you, with a scarcity of jobs that are good paying, how else you've turned to making a living? I know that you do graphics work, you do covers for people's albums, and I know that you do this wonderful email every week called News from the Trenches, where you're selling off your comic books and various other things. Talk a little bit about News from the Trenches, how people can get on your email list, and in general, life, money-making life alongside being a musician.
Yeah, well, to use the pandemic term, I've had to pivot many, many times. I've always done graphic design. I actually worked as an art director and as a publications director for many, many years. And when I lost my last full-time day job, when I lost my first-time day job, I decided to see if I could be a full-time musician. And that's when I became a full-time musician. And that would have been in 1984 or 1985, I think. So yes, I do. I design posters and flyers and CD packages and basically whatever, mostly for musician friends of mine. Recently, I've been teaching quite a bit. I teach basic guitar for the Park District of Oak Park, and I teach bass at the School of Rock in Oak Park, and I have private students as well. The writing of the News from the Trenches, it's a pretty long, involved story how that began, but I've always loved to write, and I feel like doing this every week has sharpened my skills as a writer and as an editor. And so I've been doing a little bit of editing and getting paid for it. I did some proofreading and editing of a crime novel lately.
Uh-huh.
And I edited and proofread a religious book by a Haitian pastor 2 years ago. Cleaned up his syntax. His English was not very good. So, those are things that I'm basically, I try to make a little bit of money every day doing something.
Well, that's great. So why don't you tell me, we got about a minute left, I think, of this segment of Live from the Heartland for the week of March 16th. Why don't you tell me your upcoming gigs, be it Ravenswood or Simons?
Okay, so Simons, we are playing on St. Patrick's Day, which is this coming Sunday, the 17th. So like I say, Simons is usually the third Sunday of every month from 9 to 11:30. And Ravenswood Tavern, which is at 1829 West Montrose, first Monday of the month from 7:30 to 10:30. I also run a jazz jam session the first Tuesday of the month out in Willow Springs at a place called the Irish Legend. So those are my steady gigs.
Well,
and I try to fill in whenever I can,
Yeah, well, I'm going to come see you. Tell people how they can get the News from the Trenches.
Send me an email request at Hashimoto@AOL.com. That's HASHIMOTO@AOL.com. And I need to have full names because it's a listserv. So if you send me an email, tell me who you are, and I'll put you on my list.
Well, I love getting it every week, and it is filled with information. And for those people who want to follow the lives and the end of life of various musicians, you've got the information. Steve Hashimoto, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I think we'll probably see each other more often. And I want to thank you for joining us on Live from the Heartland.